Hey, guess who's shorting the Treasury market again? Jim Rogers! That's right, the same guy that shorted when rates were at 5%, then at 4%, then at 3%, then at 2%. And for those of you who are not familiar with how bonds work, falling rates mean bond prices were rising. So he was selling the whole time, or at least he was telling people to sell. And that's probably more like it. He was telling people to sell. Unwitting, unsophisticated people who followed his advice. And the media? Well, they just gave him a free pass. Never questioned the fact that he's been nothing but wrong for years and years and years. Actually, it's quite likely that Jim Rogers was only telling you to sell, and he wasn't doing it himself because he's way too smart to follow his own advice. And if he did follow his own advice, he'd have absolutely no money. Let's face it, Jim Rogers makes his money by getting paid to give speeches and writing books and telling you what to do with your money. He doesn't play with his own money. If he did, he'd be broke, or if he were any good, he'd be running a hedge fund. Anyway, let's get back to the bond market. Okay, so rates have popped up a bit recently, which means bonds have come down. Does that mean Jim Rogers is finally going to get this thing right? No. How do I know? Well, I'm going to share a little secret with you. The Fed told me. No, I don't have inside information. I don't need inside information because the Fed tells us. It told me, it told you, it told everyone. It meets every month and decides on policy, and then it tells the public in a publicly released statement, which is followed by a publicly released record of its meeting. It spells out exactly what it's going to do. And in one of its recent meetings, it said that it won't even consider raising interest rates until the unemployment rate falls to 6.5%. And it's 7.9% now. So there's a long way to go. Until then, the Fed's going to stay easy. So long-term bond yields won't rise that much. And why is that? Because at the end of the day, long-term bond yields are anchored by Fed policy. And all that means is that a long-term bond yield reflects the expectation of Fed policy over the duration of that term. If the Fed says it'll keep rates low for the long term, then long-term rates are going to stay low. Now, sure, they could bounce around a little bit, but they can't divorce from Fed policy. Now, people like Jim Rogers don't understand that. They believe that the market sets rates and not the Fed. Well, they're wrong. The central bank sets the rate on the money that the government issues. It has the total power to do this because it can control the amount of money in the banking system. Lots of money in the banking system and the rate goes down. Little bit of money in the banking system and the rate goes up. The market earns or pays whatever rate the Fed decides to set, but the market does not set the rate. And if you don't believe me, why do you think everyone sits around glued to their TV screens or computers waiting for the Fed's statement at the end of every FOMC meeting? Because they want to see what policy the Fed is pursuing and what rate changes, if any, are going to occur. Rogers seemingly has a hard time understanding this. He sees the amount of treasuries outstanding as some huge debt that we will never be able to pay back, with the government ultimately forced to offer higher and higher rates to attract borrowers. But the government doesn't borrow. It doesn't need to borrow. It issues its own money. And all those treasuries, well, they're just dollar bills held in a different form. But they're still dollars, and the government can issue any amount of dollars that it wants. It can also very easily change those treasuries back into cash. And FYI, that constitutes paying it back. And it could do this as easily as your bank could switch your money from your savings account to your checking account. The problem with Rogers is he's still living in the gold standard days when the government's money was not its own. It came from somewhere else, from a gold mine or something. Under those conditions, the issuer of the money, or the gold, was the one who set the terms, not the government. The owner of the gold decided what rate it got for its gold, and the government had no choice but to pay or be stuck with no money. Not the same thing now. But Jim Rogers, with all his supposed wisdom, he doesn't understand this. And neither do a lot of people, but Jim Rogers has made a whole industry and a whole lot of money out of taking advantage of people's ignorance. He's made a fortune, in fact. But it's a fortune that demands you stay uneducated, ill-informed, and stupid. You want to be stupid? Go ahead, that's your prerogative. Stay stupid and give your money to Jim Rogers if that's what gets you off. On the other hand, you could be smart and you could do the opposite of Jim Rogers and poke fun of him at the same time like I do. Then you'll have money and laughs, and that's a great combination. Anyway, that's it for now. This is Mike Norman saying, see you next time. Bye-bye.